Hello, everyone, and welcome to Making Remote Work. Today, I'm welcoming Julien Clement, Assistant Professor at Stanford University. Julien, welcome to Making Remote Work.
Hi, everyone. Thanks a lot for inviting me. I'm excited.
Me too, especially that we are going to discuss about areas, you are studying areas that are near remote work that are very interesting, and I think your findings and your research will be extremely nice to discuss in this context.
I hope so. I think most of my work doesn't tackle directly remote work, but I think most of my research is on organization design in general. And yeah, I hope the conclusions that I'm reaching can at least be a little bit helpful in thinking about remote work and how to design organizations in that environment in general.
To start with, would you be okay to introduce yourself and your research?
Of course. So I'm an assistant professor at Stanford. I've been at Stanford for 2 years now. I'm French. You can probably hear that. And I do research on organization design. So most of my work is about issues of coordination inside organizations. I'm trying to understand a bit better how organizations can help their members work better together, how to find the right people to work with inside organizations, and how to adapt all of that as the work environment changes in general.
Any particular reason why you started studying this?
I think at the beginning, so I mean, if one idea that comes back, I think in a lot of my research is the idea that there's a formal and an informal structure, right? So as a manager, there's a lot of things you can set formally, like incentives, workflows, who sits with whom, a lot of different decisions that you can make. But if you look at an organization, there's always going to be a lot of deviation from that. Right? People find their own solutions to problems. They find people to work with when they have a problem, and so things can look quite different basically from what you would assume just looking at the organizational chart. And sometimes that can be a bit frustrating as a manager, right? It doesn't mean that it doesn't work though, right? Like I think there's organizations have an interesting way like that of working in a way that looks very different from the formal structure, but often still working relatively well. And of course, my job is to think of how they can work even better. And I think the reason I found that interesting, and first because I think it's important and I think managers should think about that, and I think they do a lot. But also, I think before my PhD program, I had a background that was a bit different from many of the people who went into a PhD. Many of my peers had studied economics, psychology, sociology, even physics for some of them. And I just did studies in business, which happens to be a pretty stupid idea, actually, if you want to do a PhD in business, because you don't learn a lot of those technical skills, these methods that you end up using in the PhD program. But it does teach you a lot of frameworks, of structured ways of thinking about organizations. And I remember when I had a short period of time working in a company before the PhD program, I was kind of shocked by how different things looked from what I had learned. Right? So you learn all these beautiful frameworks, these beautiful structures, and you get inside an organization and nothing looks like it. It kind of looks all chaotic, and it still has a way of working, right? But it's quite different from what you've learned. I think that kind of stayed with me and trying to understand this interaction between all the stuff that's said formally and what actually happens on the ground, and how it, basically how we can make it work better, how we can make sure that everything adapts when the world changes. I think that's basically something that stayed with me and that I'm interested in.
And that's what drew me to your research as well. And there are two areas also that you research that are very, very interesting. You study esports and you study agile organizations in particular.
So that's right. I mean, I study esports quite a bit. That's what I've spent most of my time on these days. I think that it's a very interesting laboratory to think about organizations. I'd be happy to talk more about that. Agile isn't something that I exactly do research on directly, and I haven't collected data on that. But I have done quite a bit of thinking on that. I think we have a piece together with Spanish Pranam, who I think you interviewed some time ago, where we think about Agile. That's something that I teach to my students as well at Stanford. So that's something where I've done quite a bit of thinking, especially thinking about when Agile can work for you and basically what are the conditions under which it can bring value for you. So it's definitely something that I'm interested in. Yeah.
Are you okay if we start with esports a bit?
Definitely.
And I have a very good friend who actually works in esports as a journalist. And when we went remote, I immediately called her and I said, "Wow, we can learn so much from esports." And how are they doing? How are you doing? Are you working remotely? And then she goes, I don't think this is a good, I'm a good guinea pig for you because we are not working remotely. These guys have competitions and the internet doesn't have the right speed, so nothing is happening. Where does your research lead you, especially with esports? Because some of them do work remotely, they do work distributed, they do have competitions with each other, continent to continent. So tell me a bit about your research on esports.
So, back to what you were saying about these connectivity issues, it is right, but it's kind of an interesting case because you would think that if there's one industry that's going to adapt fine to being remote, it's online gaming, but it turns out that it wasn't that easy, right? So it's because of a problem that they call latency. So the latency is just the amount of time it takes from when you make a click on your computer for it to go to a server, and that takes more time basically if the server is 5,000 miles from you than if it's just right next to you. And a lot of the tournaments that there are in esports are these global big tournaments that are actually very, very fun to watch because you have teams from all over the world, typically people coming in stadiums all together, which isn't possible either right now. But the main issue was this fact that since these are really fast-paced games, if you have even just 200 milliseconds between the time you make the click and the time it gets registered, you can't do that anymore. And I think the answer from that industry has been quite interesting, which is that now it's going for a local remote model. So you have a lot of tournaments. There's actually more tournaments now than there used to be before the pandemic. But these are all tournaments that happen within regions. So these are happening within America, within Europe, within China. You don't have these international tournaments anymore. And I think it's an interesting case of, in a way, kind of accepting what can't be done anymore with remote, right? So these tournaments just can't happen anymore. But also thinking about what you can do in that setup that in a way you couldn't do before, right? So having more content, as I was saying, and also having different types of content. The other day I was watching a tournament which I thought was very interesting because you had a huge amount of different commentators. Basically, every game was being commentated by a different pair of commentators, which typically you can do because, again, you have to fly in the team of commentators. Now people are casting from their bedroom, right? So you can have as many commentators as you'd like. So I think it's been interesting in terms of thinking, like the lessons from that would be, I guess, both not dwelling on nostalgia too much and being crafty, right? Being innovative, being kind of broad in how you think of the area of possibilities of what you can do, and sometimes even thinking about things that you couldn't do before there was this new setup. And it's actually kind of interesting because I think it's, back to your question about my research on esports, I think it mirrors a little bit the research that I'm doing, actually looking at these teams and how they adapt over time. Right? So like the research that I do is literally looking at how these teams play the game. So I have data in the 5 last years. I can tell you every mouse click that was made by anybody in one specific game in esports, which allows me to tell you every choice that teams make, right? These teams have different heroes that they play, for instance. They have different strategies that they can put together. And so over time, I can tell you whether they change the types of tools that they use. For instance, like, do they use different heroes and all that, and the different strategies that they use as well. And what's been interesting to see is that every once in a while, the game's going to change, right? Like the game manufacturers, the developers want to keep interest in the game, so they're going to change the rules of the game. They're going to change what different heroes can do, what different heroes you can play. And actually, one tendency that I've observed in that industry is that teams are going to change the tools they use, right? They'll change the heroes that they use, but they'll use them to basically relearn the same strategies they had before. So, like, very often they'll find new ways of doing exactly what they were doing before with their new work environment, but they don't do this additional step of thinking, well, now we figured it out with these new tools. Can we have new strategies that we can put together to actually perform better? And if we think about remote work, I think that's a situation that we can think through that lens as well. Basically, not just thinking about, okay, how do we reproduce our activity in that new working environment now that we can't be all together in the same room, but also thinking about, well, are there actually some things at least that we can do now that actually weren't that possible without remote work? I think it's actually a nice lens to look at that.
It's a good reflection to actually have, because you are using all these different tools and are sitting in different places. So new lateral thinking might help. For those who are not used to esports, can you maybe do a bit of a definition so we understand that this is not just playing on the computer when you have spare time, and this is actually an industry that's growing, and we can learn quite a lot from them.
That's right. So esports is kind of funny, because it's actually a pretty huge industry. There's millions of people, millions of viewers, basically, who really watch every tournament pretty much. But people who are outside of that world very often don't even know that it exists. Right. So I know that before I started working on it, I really had no idea of the extent of it. So esports is basically people playing video games for a living. And it's actually a pretty huge industry. I think I saw some statistics from last year saying that there were about, I think, slightly less than 1 billion viewers, on esports in general, and the amount of money that's at stake is actually pretty huge, right? So like the biggest tournament of the year last year, I think, had $30 million of prize pool, which is interesting as a phenomenon in itself, and for me as a researcher is interesting because I can make a pretty safe assumption that if you're playing for $30 million, you're actually trying to win the game. Right? So I can study these teams and basically see how they adapt their activity over time, how they adapt the way they play the game, and make a reasonable assumption that none of what I'm observing is just because they're having fun in the game. This is actually a job for them.
Definitely, and at some point, I don't even think they're having so much fun. They actually have responsibilities and tasks. They train every single day. It's a hard job for people who are very young. Some of them, depending on the game, are literally under 18. I mean, you can play Dota, for example, from when you are 13 or 14, and they train on it every day, and it's kind of a job. What are you studying exactly in esports?
Esports, so as I was saying, most of what I'm studying is around organizational adaptation. So trying to understand when your work environment changes, how do you react to that as an organization, as a team in this context? So do you change the type of strategy that you had? Do you find new work processes as a way of adapting to that? And are there different kind of team dynamic that can help you do that? So for instance, one thing that I see in those teams is whether they're organized in a relatively flat way where basically everybody seems to have a say during the game, or is there a clear leader who's basically calling the shots and telling everybody what to do? And what I find in that context, which I find pretty interesting, is that when you have these changes to the game that are kind of difficult to think about, and then where it's difficult to understand what should be done, teams that have more of this kind of flat, structure with a lot of information being shared by everybody, they seem to actually do better. They actually seem to do better at adapting not just the tools that they use in the game, but really the way they play the game in general, which I think makes sense, because if you think about adapting to a completely new working environment, at least an environment where there's a lot of ambiguity, nobody has seen that environment before, right? So there's no clear, it's not completely clear that one person would have a much better understanding of what's going to happen than the other. So having this kind of a collective, team-wide process of trying to make sense of things seems like it helps a lot, for instance. That's one thing. That's one project that I have in that context. I have some other projects that are interesting around trying to understand how people allocate tasks with each other. So like when you have a team that's new, when nobody has been working in that team before, how do people make decisions about who's going to do what, who's going to work with whom? So I do a lot of things with both organization design and trying to understand how organizations adapt to a new work environment based on that design, based on those decisions made beforehand. I think esports is a really nice laboratory to look at that, just because we observe so much, right? Like we can observe literally every mouse click that's been done. We can observe some communication patterns between people. If we were to try and do that, not just in one quote-unquote traditional organization, but in many different ones, because we want to understand how differences between organizations affect how they behave, it'd be incredibly difficult to get this kind of granularity. So I think this context is just great for us to see things we haven't seen before, and then basically wrap our head around mechanisms that we haven't taught before, and trying to think about how they might apply to other organizations out there, basically.
How can they apply to remote work? I know you've done some thinking on this. So how can we apply what you've learned in esports, the way the teams work, the way they are set up, their responsibilities, the way they collaborate and communicate? What could we apply to remote?
So I think a lot of at least the way I think about remote work in that setting is just through the lens of how you adapt to new work environments in general, right? So and I think really, I think I've already mentioned some of that. Really having this kind of not just basically first and second order adaptation, right? Like first trying to figure things out, trying to reproduce the way we were working before as best we can, but just not stopping there. I think like kind of going further. Perhaps like once we figured out the basics, trying to think a bit more broadly. And thinking about basically, perhaps like new activities, new ways of doing our activities that we could implement to actually create more value. I think that's really probably the biggest lesson that I see from what I've seen in there that I think really directly translates to remote teams, because I think when we have to adapt to something, especially when it's something that wasn't planned, but that kind of like falls upon us like that, it's a very natural reaction to think, okay, wow, it's already difficult enough to kind of figure out what we were doing before. So it's kind of natural to stop there. But I think there's a lot of value in at least thinking about other things that we could do in that new setting. And it's possible that the answer to that question is, well, there's not much new that we can do, but there's gotta be, there's so many different organizations in different settings out there that I would be very surprised if there weren't at least a small set of organizations, and my intuition is that it's not that small, where you can create value in a new way in that setting. Another thing that doesn't quite come directly from my research, but that I think applies pretty well there, is just the amount of planning that I see in these teams. So it's just my observation, just hanging out with these teams, seeing them when they work. One thing that's really striking is the amount of planning that goes on before the game. And I think that's something that's relatively true of sports in general, but I think it's even more true in esports. And it makes a lot of sense simply because when you're in the game, when you have all these split-second decisions to make, it's very difficult to kind of take a step back and say, okay, what are we gonna plan again now during the game? So everything, you really have to come to the game with a plan. And in a way, if we think about what remote work does to us, it's kind of a similar dynamic, actually. It's basically reducing the bandwidth that we have in communicating with each other. We can still communicate, but clearly the kind of relationship we have, the kind of information we can share isn't quite as much as if you and I were sitting at the same table and could observe what we're doing, right? And so actually something that I've even experienced when I was teaching is that I think in the remote setting, it seems to me that planning ahead and being very explicit about what our plan is, what needs to be done, seems to be more important. It seems important to make it very clear what the rules are, how things have to be done, not just because it's harder for people to just go and ask for advice, right? Because you're not meeting people in the corridor anymore. It's also harder as a manager to really see what they're doing because people are working from their bedroom the whole day. Right? So thinking about that, I think is quite important.
You did some studies on routines and how teams get together and form these routines so they can be more productive. What can we learn from your research on this and apply to remote, especially for new teams?
So that's a good question. I think one thing that I find in that setting, one thing that's pretty cool about esports and especially the game that I'm following is that there is one setting where you see teams being formed randomly. So there's an algorithm in the game. As a player, whether you're good or bad, you're just going to click on "I want to play a game," and the algorithm is going to match you with people of similar levels. And just out of random chance, you might be matched with people who you've never seen before, maybe people who you were in a professional team before in the past. And so for me as a researcher, it's wonderful because just randomly I can see this variation and I can start asking myself, well, what happens when I see a team where nobody knows each other? What happens when there are people who actually have worked together before? What do we see there? I think one thing that's kind of interesting there, again, because I think it is a setting that you can kind of compare to remote work a bit better because the fact that people don't know each other just reduces the bandwidth of communication that they can have. They actually are remote in that setting. They're never sitting together in the same setting. And what I see is that actually having people who know each other, work on the same, work together on tasks, and they can work very closely interdependently, seems to help. And that's an early analysis. I haven't published the paper yet, and it's relatively early, so I would say to take this with some kind of caution, but it kind of makes sense, right? In a world where it's really difficult to coordinate because you're in a new environment and you don't quite know how to work in that environment, and you might even have to work with perhaps people that you don't even know from before. Relying on this relationship that you had beforehand is a way of relying on prior routines that you might have with them, even just relying on the fact that you communicate better with them. Something that I've found in my personal experience, and I think there is some research on that as well, is that actually remote communication works better when people have already met in person before. And so to some extent, if that's a lever that's possible for your organization, I would say, if you have the possibility of creating things like this where people have worked together, before non-remotely, that's something to, I think about and rely on.
Routines, I imagine from all the research, make us more productive, right? Having them in place, having processes that we all know and adhere to, they make us more productive. If a company forms a remote team and no one knows each other, how can they form these routines remotely so they can learn how to work together, trust each other, and be more productive?
Well, so again, that's something where I actually don't know that, at least I can't think of any research directly on that. But I think we can think about this just from what we know about routines in general, right? Two things that we typically think of when we talk about routines is the fact that they're partly emergent and they're partly tacit. What I mean is that, of course, typically there's some planning that goes behind routines, right? But there's always going to be some mutual adjustment between people over time. And these adjustments aren't always explicit. Sometimes you're just looking at what other people are doing. You just basically copy what they're doing because it seems right. Or you might encounter some kind of problem and you ask someone, again, in the corridor, at the coffee machine, whatever it is, and you adjust your behavior in that way. That's something that's just gone now, pretty much, right? So you don't observe people quite as much. You typically have fewer opportunities to just randomly interact with them. And so, again, I haven't done research on this, but it just seems quite logical from that point of view that just trying to codify what we want to do as much as possible, I think seems like something that might help, right? So like we can't leave things to chance quite as much, because just people are less likely to even go and ask for advice. That's actually something that I've heard in a few conversations that I've had with managers since COVID. People are well-meaning and typically they'll try to solve the problem, and it's actually a lot harder to go and ask for advice when you actually have to take the step of sending an email, of sending a meeting and all that. So people have a tendency of just working on their own a bit more, and so codifying how they should work is, I think, one thing that can help. The other thing is to just try and recreate the opportunity for random interactions to happen, right? And that can be difficult also because different people like this to a different extent. Like there's extroverts and introverts. For people like me, having 10 meetings on Zoom every day is a bit tiring. I think the Zoom part is tiring for everybody, but I think some people enjoy meetings more than others. But I think thinking about how you can create those opportunities for random interactions, I think is quite interesting. And so like some solutions that I've seen are, for instance, having formal meetings where everybody comes together to debrief on their day. At the end of the day, you might find out that in 10 minutes you don't have anything to say to each other, and that's fine. But if there's some problem that emerges, people can discuss it through that channel. Something else that I've seen is kind of interest groups, basically, where people just talk about whatever it is that they're interested in. It's just a means of socializing. But, socializing is very important, actually. Like preserving the social fabric of the organization remotely is not a trivial thing. But again, like through these social interactions, even if you're talking about football, it might still be a way, while you're having that conversation of saying, oh, by the way, I had this problem the other day. How would you go about that? Right? So I think preserving these opportunities for people to just ask each other randomly about things that can help them in their work, I think is something that sometimes we don't necessarily think about right away, again, because we're trying to solve like the very primary problems that we're encountering. But these are likely to be quite important, especially in the medium and long term, I think.
Yeah, and talking about some what we just discussed, I've seen companies that are actually playing online board games or just computer games to get to know each other better, right? What I want to ask is it better that the organization designs this kind of interactions, or is it better that they leave it to their teams to do it?
That's a very good question. I at least have some research that suggests that setting some of it formally can be helpful. And the reason for that is that just, as a person working in their day-to-day life, adapting to a new setting like this just takes a lot of your energy already, right? So having this kind of second order thinking of basically thinking about, okay, how do I preserve my social network so that 2-3 months from now, when I have problems, I know who to talk to, or it's just like easy for me to talk to them. It seems pretty logical that it's going to be hard to have that thinking. And even if you do have that thinking, you still need to go and organize these kind of forums for people to interact together. So in general, like in some work that I've done with Spanish for Anam, actually, the logic that we had is that if you can create forums of interaction for your employees, but not necessarily force them to take part in them, you're at least giving them the opportunity to go and interact with other people and basically test the hypothesis that they might benefit from it. If they try it and they don't like it, fine, right? But I think actually having this thing designed in the first place, I think gives you the opportunity to find something that's gonna be helpful. Whereas if you just leave it all to your employees to do, it might work, but my bet is that it's gonna really depend on a bunch of different things about your organization, depending on what kind of social environment you had beforehand. You might have a spirit of community that's a lot stronger than other organizations, for instance. But leaving it to chance seems pretty risky to me. So at least making some efforts to create forums like these for interactions, I think is likely to create some value.
I like what you just said about testing and experimenting. What kind of data should an organization collect? So if they're running this kind of experiments, right, to see, hey, if I design this, does it work? Are they happy or not? What kind of data would you collect to ensure that you are testing, you can test your hypothesis?
That's a great question. So there's different ways you can go about this. Surveys are always helpful. Of course, they enable you to kind of like scale and have the opinion from as many people as possible in the organization. The caveat to that is, sometimes depending what you're asking about, depending on your organization, people might not want to share it. And the other thing about surveys is that when you ask people for their opinion, you're kind of committing to taking their opinion into account, right? So you have to be sure that you're okay with this as a manager. But they are helpful. Other things that you can use are, like the middle managers in the organization typically have good visibility over what's happening at the ground level. Same thing for informal leaders, for instance. I think in most organizations, like the managers typically have an idea of who are informal leaders, who's someone that people go to for advice and all that. These are great sources of information. I think during times like these where there is a lot of change happening, keeping visibility of what's happening at the ground level is really important. So they're extremely helpful. And so once you have that kind of information, either through surveys, through managers or informal leaders, in some cases actually even through archival data. So I know that things like Microsoft SharePoint, for instance, can allow you to have an idea of course, not looking at the content of communication, but knowing who communicates with whom, who goes to meetings with whom. Comparing what you see in systems like these before and after you go remote, can be I think very, very interesting, because it will give you an idea of how, again, the social fabric of your organization is evolving when you go remote like this. And the last resort, and that's something that I'm teaching my students here, is that if you don't really have an idea of all the information you need here, if you can't really collect that kind of data, you can make your own assumptions. So what I teach my students is to use simulations basically to kind of make predictions about, for instance, organizational change and whether people are going to be convinced about some new initiative that you might try to implement in your organization. And again, if you have data on who are the informal leaders, who talks to whom, and all that, wonderful. You can plug that into your simulation and make predictions based on that. And that's actually a very powerful tool. But even if you don't know, you can try different scenarios, right? And try to understand basically which assumptions you need to make for things to work, for instance, for organizational change to be successful. I think as a manager, having that kind of information is super useful. Sometimes just to actually challenge our own assumptions. Sometimes, like we're enthusiastic about things that we want to implement, so we just assume that it's going to work. Having these types of tools that show us what needs to be true for that to work is actually extremely useful. Sometimes we realize that it's going to be a bit more challenging than what we thought, and then we can strategize about what to do to still make it work.
And not wanting to give work to all the analysts that companies are hiring, especially in HR, right? People analytics is big right now, but I think this would be a nice study for them, a nice research for them internally, which could bring quite a lot of results.
Definitely, that's what I tell my students in my class. First, I mean, especially simulations, I think, are an area where we often assume that it's extremely difficult to run them. But actually, even running a very simple simulation can bring results. Again, just in challenging our own assumptions about whether things are going to work. And any analyst who knows a little bit of programming language can put that together, right? So again, like I apologize to every analyst out there that might have to work more because of what I'm going to say. But I actually, myself doing some analytics as well, I actually find this a pretty interesting exercise to go through, and you can really learn a lot from that. Out of the whole, let's say, analytics, suite of tools that we have, that's actually one of the ones that I really feel is underutilized. It's not difficult to put together, and I don't see a huge amount of use for that. So I think there's a lot of potential there.
True. But don't worry, Julien, I will put a link of your LinkedIn and where people can find you in case they want to run the simulations and they do not know how.
So maybe I'm creating problems for myself there.
Talking a bit about the change process, because you've done a lot of research there. What can we? This will be right. We were forced into remote work when the pandemic started. But a lot of companies have announced that they are moving towards remote, or they are staying remote. There are still a lot of changes to be done, a lot of adjustments, so everyone can have this type of work and not still use their bedroom or their kitchen and have a proper place to work. Organizations will need to change processes. They might be even need to change tools and systems. What can they learn from your research so they can make this a bit easier for themselves?
And clearly, if we were talking about this 5 months ago, I think the clear advice that I would give is just get your Zoom set up right. I think if we had all done that, we probably would have saved ourselves some pain, but I think we're all past that painful hurdle now. I think the main advice that I really would have is to try and keep visibility over what's happening to the organization as you go through that transition, right? So keeping data as much as possible on how people are interacting, how they're behaving, how they're working. Of course, Zoom means that that preserve basically transparency about what you're collecting and all that, right? That's very important. But I think it will be interesting even the people who are working at any level of the organization right now are curious about what's happening to the organization in general. Right? It's like one thing that happens actually that gets removed as we move to these remote settings, that our own visibility over the whole organization just diminishes so much. Right? I can even tell this in my own department. I think perhaps in academia, I think we're a bit more shielded from that because we're in a work where we're a little bit more independent to begin with. But I see my colleagues less. I know what they're up to a lot less, and I'm curious, right? So I can only imagine that people in some organizations would want to know that a lot more. So I think collecting data about what we just discussed, I think is going to be interesting both to run your own kind of analysis and bring your, basically inform your decisions better, but also to give an image of the organization to your employees, to the members of the organization, so that they understand a little bit better how the organization is moving through the change and basically what's happening to all their colleagues. So I think that's really quite important, I think.
You just spoke a few minutes ago about these social networks, right, that form inside organizations and getting some data on them. How can organizations use this? And is there a better way to figure out who are the supporters and who are against the kind of change you want to go through? Who is maybe more important or mostly influencing the others, and how you can use them to the company's advantage?
So, in general, I think network analysis can be used in a lot of different ways. I think, again, like there are organizations out there that use network analysis, but many don't. I think network analysis is one tool where basically you can use it at a lot of different levels of sophistication, but even if you use it at the lowest level, you're already going to get some value from it. Right? So again, at the lowest level, it's about identifying who are the informal leaders in the organization, who seem to talk to a lot of people. So just having that information is just super important, again, because per what you were just saying, when you go through a period of organizational change, when you have to create buy-in for instance, like the way you're handling remote work or any other type of change you're thinking about, knowing who's going to be central in the organization is really quite important. Right? So that's something you can data on. You can get data on, as I was mentioning, through surveys, through observations of your managers, through the kind of archival data that you can see through Microsoft SharePoint and all that. It becomes very powerful because basically having people inside the organization who are in favor of whatever change you're thinking about is basically the first step towards adoption at the level of the whole organization. Of course, it's not sufficient, right? So you need to do more than just convince a few people in the organization. And so thinking about how you can do that, what kind of levers you can use to not just make people buy in once, but actually go and help you create buy-in for what you're doing within the organization is very important. And there's a bunch of formal means you can use there. Incentives are always helpful. Formal responsibilities, for instance. So like, if you find out that someone is an informal leader within your organization, you think they're really gonna help create buy-in for whatever decision you're making, there's no reason that they have to stay an informal leader, right? They can also become a formal leader for the initiative that you have in mind. So like creating these kinds of positions sometimes helps, basically motivates people a lot in creating that kind of buy-in. And something else that I've seen in research that I found very interesting, I think so some of it is from the work of Kate Kellogg, who's at MIT, is the idea that you also want change agents and these informal leaders to be visible to each other, especially at the beginning when you're trying to create buy-in for some decision you have, and there isn't a huge amount of buy-in within the organization yet. You want to make sure that the few people who are convinced don't get demotivated because they see that everybody around them hasn't been convinced yet, and they start believing that it's not going to work. Right? So like giving them some kind of visibility, creating some kind of cocoon where they can reinforce each other's opinions, interact with each other, maybe even strategize about how to convince others within the company is something that I found quite interesting. So that's the first step towards creating buy-in more generally. I'm not sure that I completely answered on the question there, but that's something that I find interesting.
I'm not sure if what I'm asking you next has ever been researched, but I was thinking about those who are negative influencers, right? Who are really against the change. Do you try to get them on board? Is that the way, or do you leave them alone because they are minority and at some point they will need to comply?
That's a good question. I don't think that there's a huge amount of work on that. I actually have some work using simulations where we look at the impact of these negative influencers, and I think that's actually something that's quite important to think about, because even if we look at management wisdom on organizational change, what we very often see is this idea of the S curve. right? So that like you build this kind of initial group of of people who are excited, and then they convince others, and you reach this point where everybody believes it. To some extent, that's assuming that change is the only thing that's getting diffused, right? But it's not, right? Like resistance to change diffuses also. People who are against the change go and convince others, and so it's actually what we call in research a dual, a competing diffusion process. I actually can't really say that we have a huge amount that we know about this yet. That's certainly something that I've been doing research on lately, and that I want to understand better, because I think you're right, it's super important. Do we have conclusions other than just saying that's something you should keep in mind? Yeah, I'm not sure that we have much better to say than that. The thing that I would just say here is it's also going to depend on the organization you're working in, right? So people who are first, like, people differ from each other, organizations differ from each other, right? So for people who are extremely negative about a certain change initiative, some of them might be even possible to convince, some of them might be completely impossible to convince. That's something that you create visibility on just by having basically information at the base levels of the organization, basically keeping in touch with what's happening on the ground. So I think the first, basically, if I have one very basic comment to make here, is that first, actually getting visibility on that, I think, is the first step. I think in many situations we actually don't have much visibility. Basically, combining both knowing who's against, but also knowing who they talk to and who they're likely to convince. And that's something that helps you a lot predict these kinds of dynamics.
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting, maybe for future research for everyone, because as you said, it's a double force. Your interest in agile organizations and flat organizations that you've studied, can we apply anything to remote?
So it's interesting. I feel like there's two questions here, actually, right? Like, on the one hand, for organizations that already use Agile, are they better equipped to adapt to remote work? And second, if I'm a manager in an organization that isn't using Agile, does it make sense to change and start using Agile to adapt to this new remote work setting? I think it's a very interesting question. My bet is that for organizations that are already using Agile, I would imagine that yes, they might be better equipped to move to remote work, but not necessarily because of the Agile methodology itself. It's more that basically the same elements that make Agile work well for a company, in my opinion, are also the same elements that are likely to make remote work easier on them. So if we think of what kind of companies are best suited for Agile in general, it's companies that work on pretty, what we call, decomposable problems. For instance, they can organize pretty easily into teams that work on separate projects with relatively few interdependencies among these projects. Very often, it's also companies whose workforce enjoys autonomy, right? Like, people like to find their own solutions to problems without too much oversight above them. Now, if we think about what's likely to make remote work easier for a company, it's at least partially the same thing, right? Like, remote work makes it harder to coordinate, so having fewer interdependencies is easier. It also makes oversight harder, again, because as we said, we don't have as much visibility. So having employees who can work well autonomously is going to make things easier. Now, so that basically means that if you are looking around you, you might see a lot of Agile organizations that do fine with remote work. That's possible. Now, as the manager of a company that isn't using Agile yet, does that mean that you should switch to Agile? I'd say not necessarily, right? Like, you still want to go through the same steps you normally would use in thinking about whether Agile is a good idea for you. So how decomposable is the work? What are the demographics of your employees? How costly is it to fail, right? Like, there's a reason we don't see Boeing use Agile, right? Like, Agile is thought of as a method that helps with search problems where having a little failure every once in a while isn't the most costly of things. And also ask yourself whether there are ways you can actually experiment with Agile, right? See if your employees like it. For instance, try a 2-day project, for instance, where people could try organizing on an Agile model and see whether that works for them. I don't think the fact that we move to remote necessarily changes the questions you should ask. I think the questions remain the same, but what you want to do is ask yourself whether the move to remote in your company makes you change your answers to these questions. If they have, then it might actually make sense to think about incorporating some elements of Agile, for instance, in your organization.
From what you've experienced so far, yourself going remote, from what you're teaching your students, what you've read, how do you see the future of remote?
I wish I knew. In a way, I'm as curious as you are. What doesn't seem like a risky prediction is to think that remote work is going to become more important in the future, and that the pandemic probably accelerated that trend. Right? I find it interesting to see that quite a few companies are seriously considering moving at least part of their activity to being remote in the long term. And I think that makes some sense because the current situation, on the one hand, has made it more salient to us that things like this can happen again in the future. Right? So like being prepared for them is important. I think the second reason for that is also that we just got better at it. Right? So I can tell you from my own perspective, as a teacher, business schools have talked about creating capabilities for teaching remotely for a very, very long time, right? And they have to some extent, right? I think at Stanford we already had what I think is a pretty successful online teaching program before the pandemic. But if you looked at the entire population of teachers here, it was a very small set of that population that was involved in that remote teaching program. And we basically heard about it when we had lunch with these teachers, but most of us had no idea how to do that, right? Now we've basically all of us, we've pretty much all experienced that. And so, we're sharing the lessons we learned from that process with each other. And so if we had to do it again in the future, if we had to do it on the long term, I can tell you that we would love doing it. I love having my students in class, but clearly it would seem like less daunting of a challenge. And so I bet that there have to be companies out there which were thinking of operating remotely even before the pandemic, but that maybe weren't sure that they could put it off, that now clearly see that they have the capabilities to do it. So I would definitely imagine that what we're experiencing right now is going to accelerate the trend towards remote.
Any new areas of study for you moving towards the future?
There's a lot that I'm doing at the moment. I still think there's a lot of things to do with esports data, just because it's so rich, right? So I'm thinking of launching new projects in that area, especially with students. I'm hoping to do that. I also do some work in more traditional settings. So for instance, I'm trying to understand how reorganizations affect the networks of companies, who talks to whom, who works with whom, and how we can, again, preserve the social fabric of an organization when it reorganizes, not necessarily just for remote work, but just even reorganizations more broadly. And lately, I've really picked up an interest in how we can use AI to make better decisions about organization design. So making organization design decisions is really complex, right? There's a lot of factors to take into account, different time horizons to consider as well. Like we can't just design to solve the problems we're facing now. We also have to think about the future and what kind of organization design is going to help us adapt in the future, right? And it's just very hard for us as humans to take all of that into account. And so thinking about how we can rely on data to make recommendations basically about design that take into account possibly future horizons as well as solving the current problems, I think is something that's really interesting. And I've started working on that with some of my colleagues here at Stanford, and I'm really excited about that.
Julien, is there something that maybe I didn't ask you and you would like to add on remote work?
I had a lot of fun talking about this. To some extent, I was, like when you first asked me, I wasn't completely sure how much I could say about this. That would be helpful. And I really hope that at least some of my research can inform, some of you out there that are thinking about all these problems and facing it on a daily basis. I really enjoyed that, and I think all that I have to say is just good luck to all of you, and thank you for making it through the whole podcast.
Thank you very much, Julien, for your time today.
Thank you.